Hello and welcome to the Calgary Institute for the Humanities 37th Annual Community Seminar. Each year, the Calgary Institute for the Humanities identifies a theme of pressing interest. This year, our theme is Water in the West, Rights of Water, Rights to Water. We bring together two perspectives on water, an environmental perspective and a First Nations perspective. The three speakers that you're about to see challenge us to think about water in new ways, how water connects us all, and how water inflects our responsibilities to each other. I hope you enjoy what you see.
So it's my pleasure to introduce Adrian Power, who currently holds a joint appointment in the Department of Political Science and the School of Architecture. Jim is dialing her up as I speak. The School of Architecture and Interior Design at the University of Cincinnati. She's an environmental, political, and cultural theorist, philosopher, and critic, and her work focuses on environmental politics, water access, and the built environment. She received the Distinguished Rivichel Award for Scholarly and Creative Work, and co-directed a project called Future Cities, Livable Futures, which was a place to share, much like today, certain issues concerning sustainable urban development. So please join me in welcoming Adrian Parker to our day.
Perfect. Hi, folks. Thanks for joining me via Skype. I was planning on attending in person, but I've been doing a lot of filming in the Arctic following Native American communities that are suffering from sea level rise, and unfortunately there was a tragedy with one of the members of the community as a result of thinning ice. He's now disappeared when he went out on a seal hunt, and there was a massive search party that went out looking for him, and they still couldn't find him, but we don't have much hope a few weeks later. So it meant that all my travel plans heading back to Cincinnati in time to fly back out to you were disrupted. So I appreciate your understanding on this. Anyway, I'm going to jump straight into it. I'm going to talk about water rights and water justice with a focus on recent events that have happened in the United States, in particular in Flint, Michigan. And I'm just going to sort of launch straight into this talk. Adopted in November 2002, Article I.1 of General Comment 15, that the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights states that the human right to water is indispensable for leading a life in human dignity. Simply, water and sanitation are the focus of the UN Sustainable Development Goal number 6. With it, the organisation aspires to ensure the availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. Now, for the United Nations General Assembly, realising the human right to clean and safe water and sanitation requires that states and international organisations provide financial resources, capacity building and technology transfer through international assistance and cooperation, in particular, they say, to developing countries. Now, there are a few basic water and sanitation statistics that are often cited by international or non-profit organisations to support and advance the Sustainable Development Goal number 6. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, the number of people using an unimproved source of drinking water increased 24% from 1990 to 2011. That's approximately 63 million people. And in 2015, despite 4.9 billion people benefiting from the use of an improved sanitation facility, there are still 2.4 billion people who are not. In turn, unmanaged fecal waste continues to pose a serious risk to the health and well-being of many people, the majority of whom live in growing slum settlements of the developing world. And my last film project, The Intimate Realities of Water, looked pretty closely at how women in Nairobi slums are being impacted by this. So if currently 827 million people are living in slums, and each month 5 million people are added to the slum population of the developing world, the issue of access to clean water and sanitation is mounting as each day passes. Now, I'm not going to take issue with whether or not water is indispensable for a life of dignity, or if it's the basis for the realisation of other human rights, such as health and gender equity and so on. And I'm also not going to take issue with the United Nations request that states, international organisations act to institute access to to clean water and sufficient sanitation services. I think these are all self-evident claims, because without water there is no life on Earth. And on average, a person can survive approximately 3 weeks without food, but only 3 days without water. So I'm much more interested in exploring how the realisation of a water right is a political action, one that has the potential to turn into political power. So the question is, what kind of political powers does realising a right to water, and the right to water in the US, produce? What I'm interested in unpacking is how the demand for environmental justice contains within it an appeal to human rights. And in this instance, that would be the right to clean water. More precisely, how does the appeal create the conditions through which a political subject emerges? Remember, United Nations Resolution 64-292 explicitly connects clean drinking water and sanitation to the realisation, I quote, of all human rights, unquote. So given this, is it politically effective to inscribe water politics with a rights-based approach? Can such an inscription be the basis for an inclusive and emancipatory political project? So what the commonly cited statistics of the developing world in support of Sustainable Development Goal 6 conceal from view are the water and sanitation trials and tribulations plaguing communities of the developed world, such as the United States. And I think, the water crisis in Flint, Michigan is just one example that managed to break through the pervasive silence surrounding water injustice for one of the wealthiest countries in the world. In 2016, the United States was ranked the 13th richest country in the world. Qatar was ranked the first. And the ranking was calculated using gross domestic product based upon per capita purchasing power parity. So like most statistics, this one I think needs some context. And a lot of my work is about humanising these kinds of big numbers. So it needs to be contextualised if we want to sort of comprehensively understand how the wealth inequity nexus amplifies the increasing urgency of clean water practices and conditions in the United States. So in addition to being one of the wealthiest countries, the United States is also one of the most inequitable. Wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few and it's not evenly distributed. Or if we want to follow neoliberal parlance, it doesn't trickle down. In 2011, for example, the Centre on Poverty and Inequity at Stanford University sounded an alarm bell, reporting that the overall level of wage inequality in the United States was fast approaching the extreme level that prevailed prior to the Great Depression. In 2015, the average annual income of the top 1% in the US sat at $1,153,293 a year, as compared to the average income of $45,567 for the remaining 99%. So put simply, in the US, the top 1% earns 25.3 times more than the remaining 99%. However, it's not only income disparities that flesh out the picture of US inequity. In 2016, nearly 500,000 people on any given night were homeless, 22% of them were children, and 69% were under the age of 24 years. In 2009, US students living in families from the bottom 20% of family incomes were 5 times more likely to drop out of school than students living in high-income families from the top 20% of family incomes. Now, employment success and income earning capacity are directly connected to the number of educational qualifications a person completes. Yet it's not only the poverty that individuals' families experience that impacts high school dropout rates. Some communities struggle with multiple forms of disadvantage: under-resourced schools, insufficient numbers of after-school care programs, few parks and children's playgrounds, a lack of healthy food options, poor health, reliance on welfare, substance abuse, unemployment, poor quality housing, residential instability, overcrowded housing, and polluted environments, all of which materialise into numerous forms of violence: negative stereotyping, racial profiling by law enforcement, crime, segregation, and discrimination. Now, inequity is experienced differently according to where a person lives, their gender, their age, their sexuality, physical ability, race and ethnicity. And there are stark gaps between who has access to quality healthcare, education and housing and those that don't. And this really did begin to play into how inequity kind of played out around the Flint water crisis. So these gaps deepen and complicate how inequity works across the United States, and it's typically poor minorities who suffer the most. As William Julius Wilson pointed out, any comprehensive understanding of how poverty works must combine structural explanations with cultural ones. However, as the recent water crisis in Flint highlighted, not only is inequity shaped by the intersection of cultural and structural forces, it's also influenced by a third hardship variable, environmental adversity. A study by Mona Hanna-Attisha analyses elevated lead levels in children at Flint associated with the water crisis. And the authors highlight not only policy failure, they also form a correlation between socio-economically disadvantaged neighbourhoods and greatest elevated blood lead levels. So one might argue that the case of Flint is less an instance of environmental hardship than it is a structural issue. Namely, it's the result of government's failure or insufficient water infrastructure. Carla Campbell correctly identifies unsuccessful water governance as a key factor in the Flint water crisis. The authors point a clear finger of blame in the direction of the city of Flint, which failed to properly treat its municipal water system. But pushing it back, against Hanna-Attisha and the view that Flint's water crisis was an aberration, a single policy failure, Michael Greenberg has justifiably insisted on the importance of developing critical infrastructures that can reliably deliver clean potable water and advance public health. Critical infrastructure, he explains, is a term used to identify public and private assets that are required for society and the economy to function. And he notes that many poor US neighbourhoods, like the one in Flint, suffers from relatively high burdens of environmental deterioration that includes water and other infrastructure systems. So the Environmental Protection Agency estimates, though, that the cost to repair and replace ageing US water infrastructure over a 25-year period will be in the vicinity of $1 trillion. Greenberg argues that in order for governments to ensure the protection of human health and safety, more comprehensive risk assessments need to be conducted on all US water sources and infrastructures. Water infrastructure is without doubt, though, capital intensive. And that's a hard call in the current climate, where funding to the Environmental Protection Agency is under attack by a political administration that's hostile to government regulation. And for this reason, he suggests public health officials are well positioned to pressure elected officials and their administrative staff to provide safe water distribution to communities. And he defends his position, saying this is not only essential to ensuring public health, he says it's, I quote, environmentally just. Now, this is a politically strategic move on his behalf, and it's aimed at trying to move the dial on an urgent situation. But in effect, though, I think this argument flattens the political terrain. So let me explain. In assigning public health officials the role of representing the water needs of underprivileged groups within the field of institutionalised politics, the work of the public health official moves beyond communicating the public health concerns of a specific community to holding political power. So in this situation, a public health official holds a representative power that's intended to be responsive to ensuring public health needs are met. Operating within the system of a liberal democracy, the public health official is supposed to speak out against an environmental injustice that is manifesting itself in poor public health outcomes, such as the high lead levels in African American children living in underprivileged neighbourhoods of Flint. Now, the public health official then is tasked with working together with elected officials to realise health reforms using the mechanisms of policy and legislation. Now, Greenberg's position relies upon a liberal assumption that in a US democracy, people effectively participate in government through a peaceful system of political representation that distributes political power amongst various representatives elected to office by US citizens of voting age. The system of representative democracy relies on achieving general consensus, and political change occurs in increments. Political action takes place along a horizontal plane, which is then translated into political change through mechanisms of reform that occur along this vertical axis of institutionalised politics. Now, these assumptions of reform-based political change, however, leave intact the undemocratic systems that led to the water crisis in the first place. In 2011, the City of Flint was declared to be in a financial emergency. It prompted officials to seek out cheaper water supply alternatives. It eventually decided in 2013 to switch the city's water supply from Detroit Water and Sewerage Department, which is public water utility, to the Carignondi Water Authority, which is a privatised water system. And the projected cost savings to the city were estimated to be in the vicinity of $200 million over a 25-year period. There's actually been some really interesting research that's come out about the push for this switch to a privatised water system, right? And that it's actually connected to opening up new fracking lines in Michigan, which is a source of public revenue. So to do this, the city had to build a pipeline to connect the DWSD. Now, after the announcement was made, Detroit Water put the city on notice, stating that it would stop water supplies within a year. So that meant the city needed an interim source of water while it built the pipeline, right? So it begins drawing its water source from the Flint River, ignoring advice to use corrosion inhibitors to ensure the water doesn't corrode the water pipes. And in a press release, city officials ignored the warnings, dispelling them as, and I quote, a myth. And to quote then Mayor Dane Walling, he reassured residents that the Flint River water source was, and I quote, regular, good, pure drinking water, unquote. So when residents started complaining a month later about the odour and colour of the water, the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality engineer, Prisby, stated although there was a difference in water hardness and the water smells and tastes different, it is safe. But by August 2014, when Flint officials tested the water, it brought up traces of fecal coliform bacteria and E. coli, and the city blamed the results on, and I quote, an irregular E. coli test result, unquote. So the city then responded by using a boil water notice to the west side of Flint and increased the amount of chlorine in the water. But by January 2015, the city was found to be in violation of the Safe Drinking Water Act. The amount of total TTHMs reached dangerous levels. Then, further on, the Detroit Water and Sewerage Department offered to reconnect water to Flint and to waiver the $4 million reconnection fee. But no, they didn't take that up. They were worried about higher water costs, $12 million a year they calculated. So they rejected the offer. But then we have a Virginia Tech research team reporting that Flint's water supplies had up to a lead content of 13,200 parts per billion. So it's important to kind of recognise that the EPA says a safe maximum lead content level is 15 parts per billion, and water is considered hazardous waste if it reaches 5,000 parts per billion. So we're looking at water that was reaching 13,200 parts per billion. So pressure starts to mount. The city issues a public statement in September clarifying and reassuring the public once again that it was in full compliance with the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act. Governor Snyder's Chief of Staff, Dennis Muchmore, went so far as to question the integrity of those who raised the alarm bell on Flint's water supply, downplaying the seriousness of the situation. He actually maintained instances of child lead poisoning was being used, and I quote, as a political football, unquote. So then we have a situation where the residents of Flint start taking to the lawn of Flint City Hall in protest, demanding state officials be held accountable for water poisoning. Eventually, in response to this water crisis, President Obama, as you might remember, signed in January 2016 a Michigan emergency declaration and released $5 million in federal aid to alleviate the public health crisis. So there's all these sorts of things that happened along the way. There were many moments when the Flint water crisis, had sort of moments of kind of political action, and alerts were sent out. Different forms of citizen participation were overlooked and overridden altogether. Many different warnings about the water quality came from concerned residents, came from public officials and water resource searchers. It's important to recognise that Flint is a majority African American city, where 40% of the city also lives in poverty. And this, prompted a report to come out by the Michigan Civil Rights Commission that determined that the structural and systemic racism combined with implicit bias led to decisions and actions and consequences in Flint that would never have occurred in white communities such as Ann Arbor and Birmingham. And with my more recent research with Native American communities, we're seeing the same thing. Like if you look at what was going on with the Lakota tribe over in North Dakota as they were protesting the pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline going under their water resource, that was actually after the pipeline was originally meant to go through white communities. But they didn't want to have that, so the pipeline got diverted over to where the reservation was. So I think what Flint exposed was the role bias and structural racism played in providing water services to Flint residents. In addition to this, putting a price tag on a public good such as water in a climate of financial emergency compounded the problem, as risky cost-cutting measures further distorted the institutional forms of racism that the Michigan Civil Rights Commission identifies. In this context, the intersection of poverty, racism, defunding of the public sector, environmental injustices and health intersected to form a punitive and dangerous combination, rendering reform-based political change dysfunctional. Even 1 year later, residents in Flint are still using filters and bottled water, and they've been instructed to run their water faucets longer in order to flush out bacteria. So what really turned the political dial on the Flint water crisis were protests by residents and an active culture built around citizen science, whereby everyday people began to participate in collecting important water samples that would be used to develop a case, and in this instance by the Virginia Tech research team of the Flint Water Study. Turning public health officials into the representatives of a political struggle that's largely occurring at the intersection of social, economic, cultural and environmental disadvantage and the political affects this generates, shifts the unit of politics away from the unpredictable horizontal plane of collective action and protest to predictable vertical activities such as policy reform and the development of critical infrastructures. Put differently, revolutionary rupture is liberalised as incremental reform-based change. Admittedly, not all revolutionary struggles are equal, not all advance the same agenda, and in order to be politically effective, they must at some point translate into institutional form and organised political action. And for these reasons, I understand the politics of water to rest upon a common right, not an individual human right to water, rather a right that recognises multiple sites of struggle as the subject of water politics. So whilst it might seem obvious to state all people have a basic right to clean water and sanitation, I think the deeper problem of how to enforce that right persists. To de-link rights-based discourse from the social, economic, cultural and political struggles in which any right is realised depoliticises how water resources work in contemporary life. In the current neoliberal climate, the privatisation of water resources is the new norm, dominating the realisation of water rights the world over. A rights-based framework assumes the connection between water resources and human well-being is a property relation. As the UNHCR states, and I quote, "Human rights are rights that are inherent to all human beings," unquote. Furthermore, a human right is inalienable and universal, that is guaranteed by law. The right to water appeals to a distinct and bounded entity, demarcated and protected under the law. This reinforces the very nature of the problem we face vis-a-vis water, namely by understanding water as a system of flows that exceed the artificial boundaries human property relations impose on it. All in all, identifying water as a human right re-represents the sociality of water relations using a neoliberal worldview. Water is a property that one owns, and this ultimately justifies leaving inequity up to the free market to solve. Unsurprisingly, from 1990 to 2002, the number of people across the world who were served by private water companies increased from 51 million to 300 million. During the same time period as Gary Wolfe and Nina Malapanian report, 6 water companies increased their operations in 12 countries to more than 56 countries. And now we have Veolia coming in trying to manage the water supplies of Pittsburgh, and they in turn have faced increasing lead levels in their water. We've also got a private water company coming in, Nestle, coming into Michigan, requesting that it increases the amount of pumping for groundwater resources. So, you know, these kinds of things are happening all over the country at the moment. As Food and Water Watch have calculated, a privately owned water utility service for the average US household costs 59% more than a public water service, approximately $158 more a year. And when water is privatised, rates increase approximately 3 times the rate of inflation. So furthermore, the assumption that water relations exist within the legalistic frame of property relations, I think also exposes a disturbingly anthropocentric bias that ignores the central importance of water to the flourishing of ecosystems and other than human species. A quick example here suffices to describe the interspecies conflict of water struggles. In response to the ongoing drought in California and the Flint, Michigan water crisis, in December 2016, then US President Obama assigned into law the $11 billion Water Resources Development Act. In addition to addressing Flint's water crisis, California was assigned $558 million for water projects that range from water recycling to desalination plants and flood control initiatives. Before the Senate voted on the new legislation, a midnight rider allowing for maximum pumping of the San Francisco Bay Delta was attached to it. The Delta is the largest estuary on the Pacific coast of America, and it's where the south-flowing Sacramento and north-flowing San Joaquin rivers meet. Pumping of water from the Delta is already incurring a heavy toll for the Delta's ecosystems, leading to declining fish populations. In this case, realising the right to water blocks from view the rights of other than human species to survive and flourish. Water infrastructure, as Greenberg understands it, are built structures, such as water purification plants, stormwater systems, levees, dams, piping systems, and aqueducts. Whilst he speaks of developing crucially important water infrastructures that provide up-to-date and well-managed physical structures that efficiently pump, treat, store, and deliver water to all communities across the United States, I suggest an overhaul of this formula, that a right to water is realised if physical water infrastructures are developed. In its place, I would maintain we create infrastructures for new inclusive social relations through which a common right to water can be actualised. As a social relation, the struggle for clean water allows us to recognise the importance of working and creating solidarities across social movements. Clean water, as already demonstrated, is not an isolated phenomenon. It's imbricated in issues such as clean energy, minimum wage, access to affordable healthcare, quality education, quality housing, healthy food, tolerance of diversity, better resources for public institutions, all of which are central to a variety of other social movements, like the women's, LGBTQ, migrant, Black Lives Matter, Indigenous, peace, animal rights, citizen science, and climate justice movements. Although these struggles operate at different scales, from the local to the national or even global, from different points of identification, within identity politics, for example, or as instances of class warfare, it may be near impossible to unite them into one political class. Nonetheless, I think their activist energies can be politically powerful if solidarities form across these fronts. So these criticisms aside, to completely toss out rights-based theory when trying to respond to the collective problem of access to clean water, I think would be to throw the baby out with the bathwater. What needs to happen is that the notion of rights has to be collectivised to reflect a right that's meaningless if isolated into an anthropocentric view, that restricts to a human right and or a right that's premised upon individual ownership. All in all, the right to water is not a self-identical right. It's filled with contradictions because as a political project, it's never complete. For instance, the water struggle of Flint residents is ongoing. So I understand the right to water to be a common right. It's articulated in relationship to history, local conditions, material resources, political failures and successes. A common right, as I understand it, is a transdisciplinary, transspatial, transtemporal, transspecies right that all fairly occupy, including future generations and other than human species. As a common right, water coheres with political antagonism and the struggles of the oppressed as they challenge and attempt to transform the violence inherent to a capitalist mode of production and reproduction. The important collaborative role citizen science played in mobilising political change in Flint shows that realising a common right to water can institute new forms of collective power, and by developing social infrastructures needed for inclusive and emancipatory political projects. Thank you very much.
So I'd now like to introduce our third panelist for this morning, David Laidlaw, who's practiced briefly in Aboriginal law in the 1990s, but his ongoing interest in the area of Aboriginal law has led him to return to the law school at the University of Calgary after 2 decades of practice. Since his return, he's explored the area and its implications for Indigenous groups and the public in Alberta and throughout Canada. He's currently engaged in research in Aboriginal issues for the Canadian Institute of Resources Law. He's currently a research fellow with the Canadian Institute of Resources Law. He holds a BSc in Computer Science and Economics from the University of Calgary, an LLB from Dalhousie University. He was admitted to the bar in 1989 and has an LLM from the University of Calgary from 2013. So please join me in welcoming David Laidlaw.
All right. The topic today I'm going to talk about is the future of Alberta waters and the implications of Indigenous rights. And despite my appearance, I'm not a member of any of Canada's First Nations. I'm actually half Hawaiian. So it's a long story, but we won't go there. So, anyway, I want to talk about Canada pre-contact. And Canada was occupied by Indigenous nations who had a different worldview. And that worldview comes clear in their origin stories. So, for example, generally speaking, Indigenous peoples lived with their creator in the world. And everything was created for a sacred purpose. And so that worldview led to respecting everything in the world, including other animals, other plants, flora, fauna, and to understand the interrelationships within that world. In contrast, the Western view from the Bible, which is called, the great code of, as Northrop Frye described it, God expelled humans from paradise, the Garden of Eden. And so they weren't in paradise. They didn't live with their Creator in the world. The Creator gave man dominion over animals and plants. So that led to a difference in viewpoint, where Western perspectives focused on control and domination. And those are two very different worldviews. Indigenous laws governed the relationships within the group and the relationship with the environment. They were sovereign nations. They held lands in defined territories that were owned by the indigenous groups, indigenous nations. And they obtained their livelihood from the bounties of the land and water. So, at contact, most of the indigenous nations in Western Canada first encountered fur traders from the Hudson's Bay Company. The Hudson's Bay Company charter in 1670 established the Hudson's Bay Company, and granted monopoly trading rights in Prince Rupert's Land. Those were the lands that were defined as being those draining into the Hudson's Bay by the rivers. And it constituted the colony of Prince Rupert's Land, with Hudson's Bay Company as, quote, lords and proprietors, with the power to make laws convenient for good government of the said territory and all employees in any of those territories. Of course, in practice, the Hudson's Bay Company confined itself to claiming territories around its trading posts and laws for its employees. And this is Rupert's Land. Those are all the territories that drain into the Hudson's Bay. The fur trade. Western Canadian Indigenous nations had some trading relationships based on kinship with other First Nations, but the fur trade provided the first opportunity to enter into the early capitalist international market system. In the fur trade, in return for Western supplies, such as food, guns, medicines, and clothing, Indigenous nations provided excess furs they'd harvested. They also gave local labor and provided supplies for the trading post, and the furs would be forwarded to Europe for sale. This was a cooperative relationship, with Western supplies being extended, often on credit, to ensure future supplies of fur. And for example, they would provide clothing in the form of Hudson's Bay blankets to have the labor that would have been devoted to tanning hides and furs being devoted to hunting. And in lean times, they provided Indigenous nations with Western supplies in order to ensure the security of the future supplies of those furs. And of course, kinship traditions led to the intermarriage of Western traders with Indigenous women, and that resulted in a distinct people, the Métis. And this was an enduring relationship, extending up until the 1980s. Fort McKay First Nation, one of the chiefs was telling a story about how in the 1970s, 1980s, you would have a household with $45,000 in annual income. And because of the loss of the fur trade, which he blames on the environmentalists and their disparagement of the fashion, in 1985, it was down to $17,000. So you can take that as you will. Anyway, Canada was organized in 1867 by an amalgamation of the 4 provinces. The BNA Act provided for a government in a similar form to the United Kingdom, but it was a federal constitution, and it divided areas of legislative authority being the federal government in Section 91 and provincial government in Section 92. Consistent with earlier imperial policy, the federal government, located in Ottawa, was given a jurisdiction over Indians and lands reserved for Indians in Section 9124, on the basis that you couldn't really rely on local policy provinces to effectively manage the Indian question, as they called it. That didn't mean that provincial governments didn't have any relevant authorities. They had jurisdiction over property and civil rights in the province in Section 92 sub 13, and they owned the lands and rights in the province in Section 109, but that was, of course, subject to existing trusts. So from 1863 to 1870, Canada negotiated to acquire Prince Rupert's Land and Britain's Northwest Territories, and it resulted in a 3-way transaction between Canada, Britain, and the Hudson's Bay Company, which saw Hudson's Bay Company surrendering its charter back to Britain on terms. Britain would accept that surrender and transfer Rupert's lands and its northwestern territories to Canada. And Canada would pay the surrender terms to Britain, who would forward it on to Hudson's Bay Company. In actual fact, Britain loaned the funds to accomplish this transaction. Of course, the Indigenous nations played no role in this transfer. So, November 1869, Hudson's Bay Company surrendered its charter to Great Britain for £300,000, various land grants, and an indemnity for any claims of Indians for compensation for lands required for the purpose of settlement. The whole point of acquiring the Northwest Territories and Prince Rupert's Land, of course, was to extend the settlement out to Western Canada because of the land pressures and the resulting dispersal down to the United States. As land-hungry farmers at the time, they had nowhere to go. So the surrender was accepted by Britain, and on June 1870, and it was effective July 15, 1870. In fact, it was delayed by the first rail resistance and only transferred effectively on December 1870. So Canada had agreed, when it got those territories, it would negotiate with consistent with the unique equities that have governed the British Crown with dealing with Aboriginals. And that was a reference, by the way, to the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which set the basis of Canada's policy, where the Crown would have a monopoly on acquiring Indigenous lands, and that would be procedurally protected by a meeting organized for that purpose to negotiate these treaties. So the federal government, in accordance with this agreement, set out to negotiate Indigenous nations in all of its new lands. And so it negotiated 11 numbered treaties from 1871 to 1921. Sorry. This is the purple areas are the numbered treaties, as you can see. There are other pre-Confederation treaties in Nova Scotia, but the yellow areas are areas where there were no treaties. And it should be noted that native reserves are still being allocated in Alberta in 2017. They're being surveyed and allocated. And of course, the yellow areas. So the numbered treaties were based on the Ontario-Robinson treaties and from the 1850s. And they were framed as, in Canadian law at least, land surrender treaties. Those land surrender treaties had identical terms, and in those treaties, Indigenous nations surrendered their rights to huge tracts of land. Treaty 8 is larger than France, for example, in return for promises that they continue their traditional way of life on surrendered lands, right, subject to those lands being taken up and used for a different purpose, in which case they would be withdrawn from their rights to hunt and fish and conduct a traditional way of life. And lands based on population would be reserved for their exclusive use. And these were called Indian reserves. And I'm sure some of you know it, but what percentage of Canada's territory is now reserved for Indigenous nations? Anyone want to hazard a guess? Sorry. Don't be embarrassed. 1%? What about anybody else have another guess? All right. It's actually 1/4%. So in 400 years, Indigenous nations have gone from controlling 100% of Canada's territory to 1/4%. And in return, they also got annual annuities and agricultural hunting supplies and other benefits. But of course, those agreements were breached. The toxic combination of government penury, in other words, they don't want to spend as much as required, neglect in not adequately surveying Indian population, and Indigenous nations' political powerlessness to enforce those terms left most of those treaty promises, in fact, the Royal Commission says almost all of them, unfulfilled and still subject to dispute. So Treaty 7, which is where we are occupied, was signed in September 22nd, 1877 between Canada and the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Blood, Piegan, and Blackfoot First Nations, the Tsuut'ina, otherwise known as the SRC, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nation, Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Goodstoney Wesley nations. With the signing of the treaties, however, they became subject to the Indian Act. So, the Indian Act, it dates from 1876. It's based on a compilation of pre-Confederation legislation dealing with Indian lands, and is substantially unchanged to this day. And the focus of the Indian Act is on protection and management of Indian reserves that were held in trust by the federal government for the benefit of the First Nations. The Indian Act required registration of Indians into bands and distributed benefits and imposed restrictions on the basis of that status, whether they're a member of an Indian band or not. It imposed government trusteeship for Indian band monies and resources derived from the reserves on the basis that Indians could not manage themselves. They were technically minors, children in the eyes of the law. It criminalized Indigenous religious practices, Sundance on the prairies, potlatch on the coast. Indigenous governance was replaced by elected officials, chiefs and band councils with limited powers. And by the way, the only ones entitled to vote in those elections were the men until recently. All powerful Indian agents controlled all of the band monies and distribution of the benefits on the reserves at that time. There, from the start of it until 1951. Their permission was required, for example, to travel on or leave the reserve, the pass system, inherit any property, personal property, or transact any business with Indians. Indians had no right to vote, except in band council elections, unless, quote, they gave up their status. The right to vote in federal elections came in 1960. In contrast, women gained the right to vote in 1919. Indians didn't have the right to vote. And provincially, in the 1960s. Alberta was the second last to do that, Quebec being the last. It criminalized the hiring of lawyers to advance Indian claims, or raising funds to do so, from 1927 until 1951. So even if you could make a claim, right, you couldn't hire a lawyer to do it without permission of the Indian Department, which of course was never given. And there was an express policy of assimilation. This is best expressed by Duncan Campbell Scott. That policy was to continue until there's not a single Indian in Canada who has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there's no Indian question and no Indian Department. That was express government policy. A key component of that was the Indian residential schools, which saw contracting for missionary teachers. They're the only ones who'd work for the pay that the government was willing to provide, because they had an alternate, an additional motivation. And Indigenous children were transported, compelled to attend boarding schools, off of their reserve, away from their home. At its peak in 1927, and Alberta, by the way, had the largest proportion of Indigenous children in residential schools. The Indigenous residential schools held 1/3 of all status Indians. So children were compelled to attend boarding schools. They were housed in deplorable conditions, subject to abuse, including sexual abuse and food abuse. And teachers prohibited them from speaking their native languages, taught them to reject their Indigenous culture and traditions as being, quote, inferior, and recoil from their ancient Indigenous spirituality as devil worship. They wouldn't allow them to talk. They taught them in English or French. And any graduate of the Indigenous residential schools either went back to their reserve, right, But they were aliens. They couldn't speak their parents' language. They couldn't communicate. And if they went to urban areas, they would migrated to as a permanent underclass. So 5 generations. So count that. You, your parents, your grandparents, your great-great-grandparents, and your great-great-grandparents were all trapped in these Indian residential schools. And when children are impressionable, if you're not loved, if you don't receive any sort of support, what do? You don't learn to love. You don't learn to express your feelings. You blame yourself. And that damage is incalculable. And it's continuing. And this was the basis of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So, Indigenous waters. The Indian Act and historical treaties were silent as to Indigenous rights in water. And this meant that the common law doctrine of riparian rights, which gave property in the water use to adjoining landowners, and in that case, the federal crown for the benefit of the First Nations, would apply on reserves. But in order to encourage settlement in arid areas, the Federal Northwest Irrigation Act, 1894, replaced riparian rights in Canada's Northwest Territories. Remember the lands that were acquired from the Hudson's Bay Company. And it claimed crown ownership of those waters by the federal crown, surface waters by the federal crown. And the original act attempted to eradicate common law riparian rights by requiring all current water users, including the riparian users, to apply for a license to validate their uses within 1 year of the enactment. Of course, that generated a whole flashback, and it was amended subsequently in 1895 to not require licenses for riparian water uses. The Act established a perpetual water license scheme for a certain amount of water, for a certain purpose, attached to land. And these were perpetual. And water use was allocated on the basis of priority of registration. So if you had a senior license, which was registered for a subsequent license, you would have the right to use all of your water allocation before any of it was sent down to the junior water license. And of course, when Alberta was established in 1905, the federal government wanted to continue the homestead program for colonization. And unlike other provinces, they did not transfer to the Crown or the province of Alberta the rights and royalties in the Alberta, and instead just provided a subsidy for Alberta government operations. Of course, this was intolerable, and this was changed by a constitutional amendment called the Natural Resources Transfer Act, which transferred to the province mines, minerals, royalties in the prairie provinces, excepting federal lands such as reserves, national parks, etc. Surface waters were transferred. They originally missed the waters in the original transfers, and they were subsequently transferred in the Natural Resource Transfer Amendment Act, 1945. Interestingly, groundwaters were never transferred to Alberta. Alberta continued the scheme of water licensing in the Northwest Irrigation Act in 1931 with the promulgation of the Alberta Water Resources Act. It was identical to the Northwest Irrigation Act. In 1962, amendments to the water law in Alberta declared Alberta's ownership of groundwater. Okay. And so the current water allocation statute is Alberta's Water Act 1996, which became effective January 1, 1999. In it, It continued the individual domestic use exemption from licensing. It created a modest traditional agricultural use exemption. So if you proved you could farm in a traditional, you'd get a small amount of water. And it also grandfathered the existing licenses in the existing order. It also required the development of water basin frameworks to manage water supply, set the amount that could be extracted from the waters. And it also it unmoored the water licenses from land ownership. So you could transfer unused water allocation between licenses on a temporary basis, or on a term basis. And it enabled the director of the water to adjust licenses, quote, in an emergency. Now, water myths. Canada has 20% of the world's fresh water. Wonderful. Okay. But only 6.5% of the world's water supply is renewable. The balance of all that other 20% is held in glaciers, underground lakes, and permafrost. So, okay, yeah, well, 6.5% isn't too bad. But 60% of that water supply goes to the north. It flows into the Arctic and Hudson's Bay. So, in the result, it's unavailable to 85% of the Canadian people that live along the southern border. In Alberta, 80% of Alberta's freshwater supply is in the northern part of the province, draining north, right? Whereas 80% of the demand is in the southern part of the province. So we don't have a unlimited water supply. And of course, Alberta's water allocation scheme is first in time, first in right. The current licensing scheme, though, does not encourage water conservation. There's no requirements to limit your production. There's no requirements to use any particular technology. And you can't lose it unless you commit one of the, offenses, which nobody ever does, under the Act. So they're essentially perpetual. The current water licensing scheme, as of 2009, is distributed in various uses. The most significant one is agriculture, irrigation. Almost half of Alberta's water is used for irrigation. And by the way, irrigation is a consumptive use, right? Very little of that water returns to the watershed. Unlike hydropower or even industrial uses or municipal uses, they're essentially flow-throughs, right? But almost half of Alberta's water is consumed in the irrigation sector. And this, by the way, is without any conservation required. So the first time Alberta experienced a water shortage was in the Dust Bowl era of the 1930s. And I haven't been able to determine this, but I believe that's when water licenses exceeded supply levels. Because, of course, we had the dirty 30s and the Dust Bowls, the drought. But rather than change the water allocation system at that time, right, Alberta embarked on this ambitious program of increasing the reusable water supply by storing water behind dams and reservoirs. Over $1 billion were expended between 1930 to 1990 on water projects. All the while, Alberta continued to issue standard water licenses. But we've reached the limit of suitable storage, at least major suitable storage sites for waters, at least in southern Alberta. And the transfers in the Water Act between existing licenses, that's a safety valve, but it doesn't increase the actual supply of water. In fact, it actually increases the incentive for prudent users of water, right? Because they get money for their unused water supply. So they're going to want the system to continue. And the current South Saskatchewan River Basin is currently over-allocated. All the water licenses, if any allocation, any water allocation has been licensed and over-licensed. It's the same thing, by the way, in the Athabasca River, right? With water licenses for various oil sands projects being granted to something like 120% of the annual flow. Now, Alberta has made a moratorium for new licenses in the South Saskatchewan River Basin, and it's made subsequent exceptions to serve First Nations needs, which we'll talk about in a minute, and enhance in-stream flows. In-stream flows are those waters that are required to support an environment. They're the ones that do all the work in providing a safe environment, and also for storage to build new water reserves. And also the Alberta Land Stewardship Act 2012 governs lands and waters based on a regional planning model, which are set as the river basins, the 5 river basins in Alberta. And the current South Saskatchewan regional plan has been approved in 2014. But climate change will further limit the water supply. So this is the observed impacts of temperature, the average annual land and ocean surface temperature to the current date. And this is from the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change 2014. For those of you who are adherents of, citizen science or whatever, and are climate denialists, there is a good website, in fact, an excellent website, that addresses all of those arguments, all of the arguments that climate denialists have advanced. It's called Skeptical Science. And of course, the Northern Hemisphere, right, has more land than the Southern Hemisphere. And land heats up faster than water. So the observed impacts over the past 100 years, right? Oh, shoot. The temperature has increased by 1.4% since 1970. Most of the change comes from 1970. Between 1912, this low line, the average in the south was 1.1% per decade, right? In the north, it was 2% per decade in the north. Starting in 1970, it's now changed to 3% or 0.3 degrees per decade in both the north and south basins. Summer flows. Summer flows, of course, are when you want the most water. It's the most usable water. And so the summer flow reduction, a lot of it based on the building up of water reserves or water reservoirs, has been declining since 1910. So in the North Saskatchewan, right, river, it's gone from 100% flows to roughly 60% in current times. In the Peace River and the Old Man, it's gone down to, again, 60%. In Saskatoon, the actual amount is 20% of the historical flows. And a large part of that, of course, is additional storage capacity, but not all of it. So, I apologize for the poor quality of this slide, but this is a model of the global warming picture. And so the representative concentration pathways, the blue lines and such like that, are a mixture of proposed scenarios. So the low one is a stringent mitigation scenario that aims to keep global warming likely below 2 degrees centigrade by the end of the century, or to pre-industrial levels. And that's embodied in the Paris Agreement. Okay. There's two intermediate scenarios, and one scenario, the red one, where with a high concentration of emissions and greenhouse gases. If we don't do anything, right, it'll fall somewhere in between there. But if you note, there's a very small difference by 2050. It's already, quote, baked into Alberta. Global warming is already baked into the world. So, in Alberta, this is the projection, right, of the air temperature, doubling in CO2 concentration, projected to have a 6 to 8% rise in temperatures by 2100. It will also cause soil moisture to evaporate, and to between 30 to 40% in the eastern part of Alberta and 20 to 30% in the western part. One of that includes, the most obvious one is Glacier Retreat. Everybody's seen the Athabasca Glacier, which is going back and back and back, right? And glaciers moderate the river flow. They store snow and re-inject it back into the river as they melt. But the loss of those glaciers, right, will lead to the lack of that moderating influence, which means increased springtime flows and lower summertime flows. And as I said before, evaporation. This is a model of evaporation up to 2100. So what does that mean? Well, by 2050, the temperature will vary up to 2.7 degrees centigrade and at a minimum 2.19 degrees in 2050. The evaporation's on the west side. So there's a whole bunch of studies that prove this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Impact on infrastructure, environment, water competition with scarcity, and the potential for drought. Right? So Indigenous rights were constitutionalized in 1982 when Canada passed, or Canada repatriated its constitution by including a Charter of Rights, and Aboriginal rights are included as Part 2 of the Constitution. And so these are the Aboriginal rights. But what do the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights consist of? What does that mean? The courts have said that the purpose of Aboriginal rights is to reconcile Indigenous nations with the assertion of Crown sovereignty by Canada, right? And the de facto control of lands and resources. So this is the mechanism to reconcile the loss of Canada's rights of Indigenous nations. So the meaning of existing and Aboriginal treaty rights was decided by the Supreme Court of Canada in 1990. And they said that any existing rights as of April 1, 1982 were protected, and extinguished rights were not protected. Aboriginal rights can be extinguished with a clear federal legislation doing so. So the question becomes, have Indigenous water rights survived to 1982? Remember the Northwest Irrigation Act, which formed the basis of Alberta's water licensing allocation? It didn't talk about water rights on Indian reserves, and it did not apply to any agreement existing at that time. So, of course, on its face, Treaty 7, having been signed in 1877, the Act on its own terms would not apply to reserves and continue riparian water rights. And even if the Act applied, the Department of Indian Affairs never applied for water licenses, right, as they were required to do, and that's an ongoing issue today. And finally, there's never been a court case, none, interpreting Indigenous water rights, right? No case. So it's basically an open season. Remember the natural resource transfer agreements and transferring the surface water? They provided an exemption for the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, right? In the actual act, the Constitutional Act. So any consideration of water allocation should, I would argue, reflect Indigenous perspectives, given the holistic and complete nature of those perspectives. And consideration of Indigenous water rights is probably legally mandated, at least in certain cases.
So I'm going to introduce Dr. Michelle Daigle, who is Mushkowuk Cree and a member of the Constance Lake First Nation, which is located in Treaty 9, which is now known as Northern Ontario. She's currently a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Geography at the University of British Columbia, which is located on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam Nation, and she'll be starting a faculty position in the same department on July 1st, so congratulations. Yay. Her current research examines the impacts of extractive development in Indigenous territories with a particular focus on water and gender. And her work also looks at how Indigenous forms of governance and self-determination are embodied through the resurgence of land and water-based practices. So please join me in welcoming Michelle.
Good morning. Wachie, Michelle Nishinikazan, and Chikamau Duchin. We already did acknowledgments. Jim did his acknowledgments this morning, but as a guest in this territory, it's only my second time here. I also wanted to give my acknowledgments and my thanks as well this morning. And so I want to thank the lawful and original caretakers of this land and the surrounding waters of this territory, the Blackfoot Nation, as well as the people of the Treaty 7, including the, and I hope I'm going to get the pronunciation right on all of these, the Siksika, the Bikini, the Ganai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, including the Chickasee, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. And I also want to acknowledge, as Jim did, that the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of the Region 3. And so I also want to acknowledge the Métis Nation and give them thanks for allowing us to be here today. And I want to thank Elder Wallace Alexson for the opening and for his smudge this morning and starting us off in a good way. And I would also like to thank the organizers of this seminar, particularly Jim for inviting me to be here today, and also Charla for arranging all of my travel, getting me here. And also, of course, I want to thank all of you for being here today and taking part in this very important discussion on water. So as I started to put together this presentation, I had a couple questions in mind that the organizers had posed when they invited us all to be here. Specifically, how do we think or rethink our relations to water? And also, how do we complicate this notion of human rights to water by thinking about our responsibilities and accountabilities to water? But also for me, it's also about thinking about our accountabilities to our animal, plant, and human relatives that we're also connected to through our waterways. And so I'm going to start to reflect on these questions by focusing on water relations that I'm most intimately familiar with. I'm going to focus on those in Mushkegowuk territory or Cree territory, what's now known as the Treaty 9 in Northern Ontario. And I'm specifically going to focus on Mushkegowuk relationships with the Albany and Attawapiskat rivers. Now, the Treaty 9, I should note, is home to Mushkegowuk, so Cree people, but also Ojibwe and Oji Cree people. But as a Mushkegowuk person, I'm gonna speak specifically from that position of being a Mushkegowuk woman. And I'm going to start with some stories and of my home territory and of my family, and then hopefully work my way to some bigger questions that I hope will resonate with others in terms of what Indigenous water relations are, but also what we share in terms of the struggles that we're facing in terms of protecting our water relations today. My kukum and my musum, my grandmother and my grandfather, Angela and Bert Moore, they were born in the 1920s, just around the James Bay. And my grandmother was born in Fort Albany First Nation, and my grandfather was born in Saskatchewan First Nation. And so we see Cache here, and Fort Albany is just a little bit south of Cache. And so both of these communities are located right on the Albany River. So my grandparents spent a lot of time on the Albany River while they were growing up. And my grandfather has since passed, but my grandmother's still with us today, and she's 90 years old. And every summer, they would leave Cache in Fort Albany with their families, and they would spend the majority of the summer traveling up and down the Albany River. They would fish for pickerel and pike, they would pick berries, they would snare rabbits, and towards the end of the summer, moving into the fall, they would go, they would hunt for ducks and geese. And this is a time when they could still drink water directly from the river. And during that time, they would, as they were traveling up and down the river, they were visiting many different place names on the Albany River, which they actually know as Saskatchewan. And many of these place names hold stories of our people. And during that time, they would also renew their relationship with Saskatchewan through ceremony. And they would also meet with other Mushkegowuk families at the Forks, where Saskatchewan meets the Kanagami River. And while they met there at the Forks, they would just get caught up on local news, they would visit with relatives, they would discuss a lot of important issues that were coming up in the territory that they weren't necessarily able to discuss during the winter months when a lot of families were out on their trap lines. And this was also a time when they would trade food towards the end of the summer before the fall and the winter, and it was also a time when they would feast. And it was really this time being out on Saskatchewan that really kind of informed them of how they would then relate with the Albany River and relate with other bodies of water on our home territory, how they would relate with the deer and how they would relate with fishing. So knowing where to fish, how much to fish, which species of fish they could fish at certain times of the year, and from year to year, kind of observing those changes as well, right? And that's really how they learned what we could call maybe natural law, but what I really kind of think of as Cree law, and how we learn that by our embodied experiences by being out on the land and out on the water. So my grandparents, like many other Mushkegowuk people, maintained their relationship with Saskatchewan, even as they were forced to attend residential school. My grandmother attended St. Anne's Residential School in Fort Albany, and my grandfather attended St. Joseph's, which was a little bit further south. And they continued to maintain that relationship as well as young adults as they took up jobs within the Canadian economy. Many men within Treaty 7, for example, were taking up jobs in pulp and paper mills and lumber mills in the early to mid 20th century. And a lot of the women were taking up jobs within the domestic sphere, supporting their husbands. And they were also taking up a lot of seasonal work as well. For example, my grandmother would go tree planting during the summer months. And so this time that they spent, particularly the men that worked in the lumber mills in the summer, so they would trap in the winter and work in the mills in the summer, that would take time away from them being out on Saskatchewan, being out on the land and on the water. But they took every moment that they could to go and renew that relationship. And I think it's important, in this era of TRC that we highlight those moments of ongoing renewal and resistance that happen even as dispossession was happening and continues to happen. That there's always that Indigenous resistance and renewal of relationships that's happening at every scale. So this is also a time in which Mushkegowuk relationships with water and their ability to govern and protect water is increasingly brought under the Canadian or colonial legal and institutional frameworks. And for example, in 1929 and 1930, there are adhesions that are made to the Treaty 9 Agreement, the James Bay Agreement. Now, the Treaty 9 Agreement was signed in 1905 and 1906 originally, and the adhesions in 1929 and 30 partly pertain to territorial adhesions. So there's territory that's being added to Treaty 9 during this time. But there's also changes in the language within the official treaty documents. And for the first time, there's language that's included on water, because there was no language at all on water in the original documents. But the inclusion of water in the official documents is really to secure and legitimate the Canadian government's access to Mushkegowuk territory for capitalist development, and specifically for resource extraction. And I just had this quote here that's from the Treaty 9 documents. It's taken out of a book written by a historian, John Long. There's been a lot of work going on in Treaty 9 right now to go back to the treaty documents and look how they were negotiated and signed, and really looking at the unlawfulness of how the treaty came to be, and the ongoing negotiations that are taking place within Treaty 9 right now. So for many elders in Mushkegowuk territory, they continue to worry about the well-being of Saskatchewan and other bodies of water in our home territory, and specifically disruptions to Mushkegowuk people's ability to renew our relationships with water and to protect and govern our local waterways, as they're becoming entangled in the newest wave of resource extraction that's now taking place. Currently, the Albany and Attawapiskat rivers are entangled in proposed mining developments that have been dubbed the Ring of Fire, a development project that will span 5,000 square kilometers and was reported to be the largest chromite deposit in North America, with an estimated value of $30 billion. And they've also found graphite and copper and nickel in the area, and there's also speculation that they may find more diamonds. There's the Victor Diamond Mine that's already been in operation there for a few years now, just outside of Attawapiskat First Nation. In 2015, nearly 24 companies held claims on Mushkegowuk territory, and nearly $300 million had been spent in mining exploratory drilling alone. We've already seen rising mercury levels in Treaty 9, and specifically rising mercury levels in the Albany and Attawapiskat rivers. Now, this is tied to an extensive history of the lumber industry in Treaty 9, but this mercury that was already sitting within those rivers is now being released through the new mining activity, specifically the mining activity at the Victor mine, but also the series of exploratory drillings that are now taking place. And it's crucial to note that these rising mercury levels are disproportionately impacting Indigenous women and youth and unborn children in the territory. Women are reporting increased rates of infertility, birth deformities, and miscarriages. And we're also now seeing rising rates of autism in Treaty 9 that are being tied to the rising mercury levels. And we do need to do more work on this and kind of investigate those connections as well. And that work is being done, but more needs to be done. So as individual First Nation communities are issued impact benefit agreements for these various mining developments, many elders are urging us to think about our decision in relation to water, our responsibilities and accountabilities to water, but also in relation to our extended kinship networks. For example, Stanley Stevens from Constance Lake First Nation asks, how are the people downriver, down the Albany River? How are they going to be affected if we support these developments? how is that going to affect their ability to hunt, trap, and fish? It's not just us that will be affected, us in Constance Lake First Nation, it's them too. And so Constance Lake is right here on the map. This is my community. And what he's talking about is how are the communities downriver, actually up the map, in Fort Albany and Cache, how are they going to be impacted as well? We have many relatives that come from there. My grandparents were born there. And so what are our responsibilities then in terms of making these decisions as we're being issued an impact benefit agreement for a mine? And I've also thought about this a lot because I've had the honor to spend time in Anishinaabe territory known as Treaty 3. And as I was there a couple of years ago and a lot of these negotiations were taking place, a lot of community members from Anishinaabe territory were asking me, what's going on up there? What does your band and council want to do about this? What do they think about it? And what do you think about it? What does your family think about it? And it really made me think about how a lot of these decision-making processes are confined within colonial jurisdictions of the reserve, but also of the treaty territories that, yes, reflect in part our understandings of what our ancestral territories are, but that really don't reflect how governance, I think, actually happened pre-settlement and pre-colonization. So I start with these stories and these everyday and embodied experiences with water because they've taught me how water is inscribed with multiple relationships, but also how water cultivates relationships across multiple scales. And while these stories are specific to Mushkegowuk territory, my sense is from having the honor to visit other Indigenous territories and living and working on other Indigenous territories, that there's a lot of commonality across different Indigenous nations, communities, and families in terms of how we think about water and how we relate to water. Elder Wallace started this morning by saying that water is life. And when he says that, it's not just that water is subsistence in the most kind of surface level and basic way, but that water is our grandmother, and she is our kin and our relative. And that we have to renew our relationship with her, just like I have to renew my relationship with my human kin. And more than this, water as kin is in and of itself a legal actor, just like we all are as humans legal actors, and that we can't forget that. Indigenous law that extends further back than colonialism, than European settlement, and then Canadian law, and in my case, Cree law, is learned and transmitted through water. This happens at the most intimate scale through direct and cyclical experiences with water, through ceremony, and it gets scaled outward. It gets built outward as those laws then guide our interactions in terms of how we govern and manage water, how we relate with our animal and plant relatives, and with each other, with our relatives, our kinship networks that we're connected to through our waterways. But these stories also tell us how our water relations and our ability to uphold our responsibilities to water have been disrupted through historical and ongoing the ongoing impacts of colonialism, and specifically settler colonialism here within Canada. And when I say settler colonialism, I'm referring to colonialism having a distinct character within particular nations like Canada, the US, Australia, and New Zealand, where the objective was not just capitalist development, but permanent settlement, and permanent settlement that occurred here in Canada in the late 19th century. And that there's an ongoing need on behalf of the Canadian state to legitimate that settlement and to legitimate that Canadian or that capitalist development, and that continues to happen through various legal frameworks. And so when I think of how dispossession of Indigenous water relations continues to happen in Mushkegowuk territory, I think of Bill C-45 that impacts many Indigenous territories, that made sweeping changes to the Navigable Waters Protection Act. But I also think of various laws that pertain to Ontario, as we're subjected to laws within that jurisdiction. So the Ontario Water Resources Act and the Ontario Protection Act and the Environmental Assessment Act that all work together in terms of of how water is managed and governed with regards to proposed infrastructural developments such as mines and hydroelectric projects. But then these come into relation with treaty agreements that then bring in larger questions of sovereignty and autonomy over Indigenous territories. Now, so as I said, these questions, I start from a place that I know well, but many people from different Indigenous territories are asking the same questions. And I just wanted to kind of finish off by highlighting this one project that is bringing together people from different disciplinary backgrounds. It's called the Decolonizing Water Project. And it's a SSHRC funded grant. It's a Connections partnership grant. And it's bringing together academics, but also community members from various backgrounds. And so there's academics who specialize in Indigenous law and governance. There's also practicing lawyers on the grant. There's scientists who do water monitoring. And there's also Indigenous artists that are teaching us about Indigenous water laws through their artwork. And one of the project's long-term objectives is to create self-sustaining water and ecological water monitoring programs that will enhance the protection of water relations and water resources. But that's not the sole focus of the project. One of the other objectives is to think about how Indigenous law, and specifically Indigenous water law, can be incorporated into these water monitoring programs, into the creation and implementation. And then how does that Indigenous water law even kind of complicate this notion of what monitoring is, right? Is it just kind of taking a sample, measuring a sample, and measuring the different sediments that are within that sample? Or is it also actually engaging at the community level and asking people how their relationships with water have changed, kind of looking at that deeper, more intimate level, and asking questions around dispossession, but also the ongoing renewal of Indigenous law within our communities. And I guess just because we're talking about the TRC today as well, and also I just wanted to kind of maybe build on what Adrian mentioned earlier in terms of, well, how do we then kind of address some of these issues of water in terms of thinking about it as water being part of the commons, right? That it's a common right. And I think it's really crucial to recenter the importance of Indigenous law in terms of how we're thinking about the commons. And so yes, water is common to all of us, and it becomes something that I think is crucial in terms of building solidarities, as we saw and as Adrian mentioned at Standing Rock. But I think what is very unique and what we do see at Standing Rock is that we see people coming from these different communities, settler communities, other racialized communities, other Indigenous communities from the US and beyond, that are coming there and they're really honoring the authority that the Standing Rock Sioux have over that territory, and that they're honoring the long-standing political and legal orders of that nation. And so in thinking about the commons, I think we also have to think about that. And if we're really going to honor what the TRC is in terms of decolonizing our relationships, we have to recognize that Indigenous people have been doing this work all along. This resistance and resurgence work has been going on all along. And it's been going on at the intimate scale within the community, and it's been going on within Canadian legal and political spaces. And that if we're really going to renew relationships, that this also means that Indigenous communities are renewing our relationships with each other, going back to that quote from Elder Stanley Stevens, but also that settler Canadians are thinking about, well, what does it mean for me to be accountable to the Indigenous political and legal orders of the territories that I come from, that I live and work on? I guess I'll just finish with that. And I just want to say Miigwech, and I'm humbled to be here in this room with all of you and with all these speakers on this panel as well. Miigwech.
Okay, welcome back. So the Calgary Institute for the Humanities, in addition to holding this annual community event, has programs within the University of Calgary that I wanted to tell you a little bit about because this film comes out of that. At the U of C, we host a number of scholars at the Institute each year as resident fellows who are working on humanities-based research projects. These people can be faculty members, graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, visiting research fellows. This year we had 8 different scholars and residents working on a wide range of topics, such as the memorials to a Roman empress, the history of the use of psychedelic drugs in psychiatry, memoirs of trauma, 16th century Swedish Neo-Latin poetry, photographic documentation of the Holocaust and the ethics of its use, and the cultural context for Miguel de Cervantes' great epic Don Quixote. One of our scholars in residence this year, Charles Tepperman, is a historian of amateur cinema. And one of his projects this year is to reassemble a program of prize-winning amateur cinema that toured internationally in 1938, featuring one film from each of several countries. And he's going to screen this reassembled program of amateur cinema at the Toronto International Film Festival this fall. Now, as it happens, the Canadian entry in the program was all about water. So I thought it would be appropriate to screen it for you today. Now, Charles couldn't be here in person. It's his wife's birthday. So he provided me with an introduction to the film that sets up its context. So the film is called sorry, I'm just going to say it in English, Glory to Water, by Albert Tessier. It was filmed over a period of years. It's both in black and white and color, and it's silent. So Albert Tessier was a well-known Quebec priest and amateur filmmaker. Based in the Saint-Maurice River area north of Trois-Rivières, Tessier made about 70 short films between 1927 and 1940. He used his films as part of the work he did, first for the Saint-Maurice Forest Protective Association, and later for the Catholic Church's program on family education. So this film is obviously from the first of those. His films captured the region's nature as well as rural and peasant life, often through a poetic and sacred lens. Most of the films he produced were silent, but he accompanied them with a lecture. We will not be doing that today. I'll have some music to go along with it. After 1941, some of Tessier's films were distributed by Quebec's government cinema service, and today Tessier is best remembered as the namesake for the Prix Albert Tessier, awarded each year to an individual for their outstanding career in Quebec cinema. So Tessier filmed Glory to Water in the mid-1930s, supplementing and re-editing it often over the next decade and a half, and you'll definitely see that. The print that survives is shorter than the original, and we can definitely see traces of the revisions in the different qualities of film stock. Some is in black and white, some is in color, various levels of exposure from over to under, but lots in between. Tessier actually described the film as abandoned, indicating some dissatisfaction with its final state. Amateur movie makers, says Charles, during the 1930s often made poetic and lyrical, polished films about nature, and so Tessier was part of this broader community of filmmakers. He described Glory to Water as his favorite movie, a subject a cineast should try. Different versions of the film were exhibited widely, and it was included in the International Amateur Movie Show presented by Columbia University in New York in May 1938. And the film is presented courtesy of the Bibliothèque et Archives Nationales du Québec.
Hi, Dr. Parr.
Hello, nice to meet you.
My name is Nancy Towsley. I'm going to give you questions from 3 tables that we have amalgamated into 2. First question is, how does a collective versus an individual rights approach manifest itself legally and politically? And secondly, how can the Indigenous perspective inform the settler conversation on the relationship of the health of water and the health of the natural world, of which humanity is but a part?
So the first one, how does collective rights perspective versus the individualistic perspective manifest itself legally, and what was the other portion to that?
Politically.
Politically, you said?
Yeah.
Okay.
Politically.
Great. Fabulous questions. Thanks for those. I might start with the Indigenous perspective first and foremostly, because obviously I've been spending a lot of time with different Native American communities across the country. I've spent time with the Biloxi Choctaw tribe down in Ile de Jean Charles, where I was filming their situation due to sea level rise. And they won a $43 million HUD grant to be relocated. And when I was there a year later, that money was still being held up by the state. And the argument that the official representative at the state level gave me for holding the money up was that he felt it constituted an act of discrimination, which is illegal if you're using national funds, to simply use that money to move only the tribal community when there were other households on the island that were not part of the tribal community. Now, that kind of position is, it's in direct violation to the way in which the grant was written, which was specifically stating to move this historic tribal community from the island. And many of the new people that have arrived to that island have come post-Katrina, and for the Biloxi Choctaw tribe, it almost constitutes a land grab because they obviously got the land very, very cheap when people from the tribe were desperate to get off the island. So to have them sort of cut off from the funds that they've finally won through a very competitive federal award system, and using the language of discrimination kind of against the grain is it's certainly obscene, to say the least. So for Native American communities, one of the biggest things that I've been taking away from the stories that they've been sharing me is, they don't think of themselves as what's the word not as sort of descendants. They think of themselves as ancestors. So it's very future oriented in how they approach, many aspects of their life. They're thinking 7 generations ahead, which I think is a really healthy way to kind of combat this sort of short-sighted, short time frame within which a lot of our own political systems operate. And I think also thinking sort of 7 generations ahead and what will 7 generations out think of me and what I've done to leave them moving forward. So that encourages a way of thinking about what you leave behind is not necessarily a material thing or a certain amount of money that gets passed on to the next generation. If you're thinking several generations out, you're inevitably thinking about what's left behind as something inherently alive. And I think that makes them much more amenable to a kind of ecological worldview. So I think there's a lot to be learnt from Native American communities. And I also think, to go back to the previous question about how does a collective right manifest itself politically, we won't get to legally yet, but politically I think there's a lot to be learnt from the water protectors at Standing Rock. They've also been very, very clear to me that they find it deeply offensive, that they've been described sometimes in the press and by political figures as water protesters. They said that completely re-represents the way in which they're dealing with the water challenges that they're currently faced with. They are water protectors. They're protecting the water for future generations, for other than human species, and also for the general well-being of ecosystems in that area in North Dakota. So I think that kind of approach is a fascinating one, and it means that then they also form solidarities with other kinds of social movements. For example, 350.org, they formed solidarities with them. They formed solidarities with the Sierra Club. I attended the march, the Native American march in Washington, D.C. that occurred, I think it was a few months ago now. And there were all kinds of social movements that were participating in that march. And likewise, they also had a very significant presence. If any of you went to the Women's March in Washington, D.C., I also attended that march. So they're recognising the importance of this sort of this shared principle of social justice that manifests itself across a variety of issues, but really they're all trying to struggle for the same thing. And that is actually, I think, a common right of sorts. And if you're going to be struggling for a common right, then only logically it seems to also stand true that the way in which that right gets expressed politically is only by forming solidarities with other kinds of social movements, which is not to say that in forming a solidarity with another social movement, you become that social movement. So I was very clear in my talk to say that this is not about kind of unifying social movements. It's recognizing that they all operate in different kinds of ways, but they certainly can strengthen one another across this shared platform, of which I think it is about a common right. And then the next part of the question was, how does it manifest itself legally? When I was in Alaska, I had the great pleasure of meeting with Eric Graffy, who is the lawyer from Earth Justice, the Anchorage office, that's leading the lawsuit against President Donald Trump. There are several plaintiffs as part of that lawsuit, one of which is an Indigenous organisation, many like conservation organisations and other kinds of Earth Justice groups. And basically, the legal case that they're making is that in signing the executive order to reopen the Arctic oceans and parts of the Atlantic Ocean to oil and gas drilling is actually unconstitutional and it's not legal. Because when President Obama placed those those areas under permanent protection, the legislation that he used to do that never speaks about being able to then reverse a permanent protection that's placed under that legislation. It only enables you to place something under protection. So what President Trump has done in signing this executive order basically has, not only does it have no precedent, but it's certainly questionable that it's even legally allowed within that particular legal framework. So I think what you have there is a variety of organisations, both Indigenous and environmental and water activists and those that are sort of concerned about climate change, coming together and garnering strength from one another and trying to use the apparatus of the law to unravel what will be, I think, a very, very harmful situation, not only to the Arctic, but if we continue to drill and extract the oil supplies that we have in the ground at the moment, it's a well-known fact that it's game over. And that's certainly something that James Hansen, NASA scientist, openly and very clearly reported to in his statement of Congress.
Were there other questions for Adrian?
Everyone's very quiet.
I wonder if our other panelists might want to build on that. Or
I think since everyone's very quiet, I'm just going to carry on. One of the things that I'm very interested in is I've found that in a lot of political theory, there's been this split between, and Hart and Magri are like this in their book on Commonwealth, which I think is an incredible book, but they still focus very much on the horizontal plane, right? That it's at the level of the multitude where kind of political action takes place. And so in so doing, they dismiss the vertical, right? And of course, there's lots of concerns around the vertical, especially when we've got the kind of president that we have at the moment in the United States. I think that exposes all the kinds of problems associated with the vertical. I think the case of Flint, Michigan exposed a lot of problems around, dominance of the vertical operation of political power in institutionalized politics and so on and so forth. But the law is also a mechanism that's operating within the vertical. So I tend to argue, and I argued this in an interview for the New York Times, I argued that it's important that we try to produce bastard solidarities. And what I mean by that is it's not just solidarities between social movements that otherwise didn't kind of work together in the past. It is partly that. But I think more strategically, it means that we need to recognise that a lot of the sort of impetus and the motivation, the energies of transformative social movements ends up being kind of appropriated and placed in the service of further capital generation, right? And if we can recognise that any kind of action that we're going to take on the horizontal plane as part of a social movement is inevitably going to get kind of hijacked at some point. And I've spent many, many years looking at various instances of this. My book on hijacking sustainability looked at the way in which the culture of sustainability was being hijacked by corporate interests and militarisation and so on and so forth. My last book, The Wrath of Capital, looked at neoliberalism and climate change politics and the ways in which aspects of the transformative potential of climate change politics was being appropriated and placed in the service of further capital generation. So if we can recognise that and agree upon that, then we also need to understand that social movements need to become increasingly nimble in the way in which they operate. And part of becoming nimble and changing position means you're not just changing position on the horizontal plane, you're changing position vis-a-vis your relationship to the vertical, right? And that's where the legal apparatus can come into play. And so I do think the law is a very, very important area, but it's one that constantly needs to be kind of held accountable. It needs to be pushed to its limits so that it continues to operate in ways that further enhance and promote inclusive forms of sociality.
Okay, thank you so much, Adrian.
Have a great day of discussion. And
Okay.
thanks, James, for inviting me.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so if the next for questions for David, if someone wants to step forward, one of the tables that. Okay, I'll hand that over to you.
So, first of all, thank you very much, David, for the comprehensive and substantive presentation that you gave on the subject, and the very complicated questions that you posed to us, which was kind of challenging, and we're sort of trying to respond on the same level of complexity, and really what it comes down to are really the bigger questions here. So, and there are three of the questions that we could sort of frame. The first one being, and it's very general, how can social and legal structures, including and especially dominant cultural narratives, be deconstructed and reconstructed in a way to be truly inclusive of all people with a relationship to water? And since that's a little bit complicated, we try to make it more simple. In simpler terms, what are the alternative structures that allow for a decommodification of water? And on a more practical level, how can consultation processes, and that was something that came up in my table in particular, how can consultation processes be legally mandated without undermining trust in the consultation process itself, which is apparently something that has happened, or so we heard.
I'll take those questions in sort of the reverse order. Can people hear me? Okay. The Alberta Land Stewardship Act requires the generation of a regional plan. And you have consultation groups fanning out across the province and feeding back the information and to government groups, et cetera, right? And part of that, of course, is having consultation with Aboriginal groups. The difference, though, is they consult with each individual Indigenous group on its own. And so there's no publicly available information on, well, did you talk to these people? Did you talk to those people? And there's no public collection or collation. And they said, oh, this is what we heard, right? And First Nations are saying, well, that's not what we told you, right? But it doesn't get any traction. So, for example, the first regional plan, which, by the way, governs all communities, municipal boards, planning boards, all that sort of stuff, becomes superior to that. So they have to comply with that. And by the way, the regional plans will have various frameworks like water planning, water quality, air quality, biodiversity quality, and stuff like that. And of course, the priority was the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan, right? Because, of course, that's where the oil sands are. And so during that consultation process, right, the First Nations were not effectively consulted, right? They made all these recommendations of, flow rates, water quality monitoring, tribal land use, water flow bases, all of that sort of stuff. And the only thing that came out of the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan was, you can develop regional backcountry trails in Richardson Provincial Park. Right? And even then, right, they wanted to protect, the terms of regional vision was to have protection of the each biome in the same area. And so the draft plan, right, and the draft plan goes to the provincial cabinet. So in other words, the final plan is approved by the provincial cabinet, and that invokes cabinet secrecy. So you have no idea what goes on behind that. And so the draft plan that was submitted to the cabinet was reduced. The protected areas were reduced from, I think, something like 31% to 20% of the areas, and they were also shifted, contrary to the mandate of providing complete biomes and ability to traverse, right? And that's it. So Aboriginal consultation, right? How do I phrase this? Alberta's consultation policy is, and I've written on this extensively, is basically a misinterpretation of the governing treaties. They talk about traditional uses as being a, quote, separate category of uses, but it's not connected with protection of Aboriginal rights. It imposes, it creates an Aboriginal consultation office that decides who to consult, and, by the way, whether or not the government has complied with their consultation policies. So you have the same government saying who you consult with, what the level of consultation, and whether or not the industry has complied with the consultation obligations. Right. So it's a farce. All right.
So you're basically saying that a starting point could be actually to interpret the existing framework right.
Right. Alberta isn't really resistant to Indigenous rights, right? Because it's a threat to oil production. It's a threat to with the environment and all those sorts of things, and it's a threat to livelihood. So they will. The rule of thumb in practicing Indigenous law is get out of Alberta, right? Go to the federal courts. You will not get, Indigenous justice in Alberta. There's only one case, right, where the Alberta government did not fulfill its constitutional duty to consult, right? And that's the Cold Lake case. One case since 2004. So that kind of gives you an idea of where that's going. So I wouldn't start with consultation. In terms of as I understand, what people are looking at is ways to assess the proper water allocation, right? And one of the ways you can deconstruct it is to look at the water uses. What do we use water for? Human survival, water, cleaning. Why do we need to be clean? Feeding animals, husbandry, and they're also providing for the environment and, base flows and things like that. And so if you deal with those sorts of issues, and then you expand it out to say, well, what industrial practices are we undertaking? And that would include agriculture, right? And if so, what is the cost-benefit analysis of water use? I mean, in California, they have they export alfalfa seeds to China, right? And or almonds or something, and that embedded in those almonds is something like 28 gallons of water, right, in those agricultural products. So it's the calculus with respect to the benefit derived from agriculture. And don't forget, agriculture is the third largest industry in Alberta. Still, and in terms of the employment, it employs the bulk of the rural population. So you need to take all of that into account. So in balancing the environment, development, human capacity, and all that sort of stuff, if you approach it in that fashion, that would be one way to deconstruct it. In another way to look at it would be to look at it through an Indigenous lens, where you have the same kind of approaches. So we need to have I would suggest we should have a total rethink, right? But of course you have to acknowledge the settled expectations of water license holders, whether or not you can vary it. And even modest changes like requiring water conservation, it requires political will, so it's a complex issue. I don't know if that answered the question, but
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Did you have were there any other tables that had questions for David? No?
Could you define for us in sort of lay terms what we're speaking about when we speak of Indigenous law?
no. Well, no, I'm sorry. I've been joking at your expense. I apologize. I'm not an Indigenous person. I'm not an Indigenous expert. I'm not an elder. I have, my views and my interpretation, but you need to ask Indigenous elders, Indigenous wisdom holders, to define the law. I mean, there is a project in British Columbia where they're trying to develop Indigenous or reconstruct Indigenous laws. And Val Napoleon as well. So, those were the people you could talk to.
I did speak to Diane before we came in, and she said that under the UN there is a body of legal, I'm not sure what to call it.
There is an Indigenous Peoples Council at the ILO, and they're directed at, and so what came out of that was the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People. Right? It's a declaration of the United Nations General Assembly. Canada was one of the 7 countries that initially objected to it, and then was dragged kicking and screaming, in part because the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People, or UNDRIP, includes in its operative sections, right, a requirement that prior to developing a project or of any kind on traditional territories, you need to have the free, prior, informed consent of the Indigenous group affected. And that could run afoul of Canada's position, right, where you can infringe on Aboriginal rights or title, right, in circumstances where it's justified. And the justification test is actually hard to meet, but it is possible to do that. And providing compensation. So UNDRIP in that part is contrary to the Canada's legal position, and they express that qualification in their approval, by the way. So in terms of and it's not an international obligation in Canada. Practically speaking, though, if you were to do any sort of new large-scale development, And by the way, some estimates have put 75% of the mega projects being more than $100 million, will go through or be included in Territory 8. The territory of Treaty 8. You would be well advised, right, to get consent. And you can get consent by, impact benefit agreements. Basically, you buy off of, the Indigenous groups, because, on Indigenous groups on reserve. In Canada in total, there are 3% of the economic activity is provided by government. 97% is generated by private business. That's flipped on the reserve. Right? On the reserve, government services, First Nations get 1/2 the per capita government services, right? Money for government services than the rest of Canada. Right? So, and the costs are high and all that sort of stuff. Unemployment is, 20% higher on reserves than comparable areas. And so if you're faced with, sufficient money, right, and you're a First Nation politician concerned about your people and their well-being, at some point the pressure is going to be, and this is just a fact of life, the pressure is going to be so high the government will throw so much money at it, right, the business will throw so much money at it, the First Nation will just consent, basically drop their objection to policy. And that's one of the things, by the way, that Alberta's consultation policy and most other consultation policies in Canada are wrong. They defer to the business corporations, right? The actual process of consultation. But some of the remedies that First Nations want can only be given by government. And corporations, they don't act on behalf of the government. They can't give them those things. Whether it's replacement territories, new lands, new reserves, they're not authorized to do that. So the only thing they can do is throw more money, right? And so you have the corporations are dissatisfied, First Nations are dissatisfied, and the government, sits in the cat seat. Yeah.
Can I just make a clarification? I just wanted to, what I shared with, I'm sorry, what I shared with her was that when I read our question on Indigenous law, how does the Indigenous law help us rethink our relations with water and guide? I was telling you our table here, the first thing that comes to my mind under Indigenous law is the treaties. And that the treaties, numbers like the 1 to 11 treaties in Canada, they've been deemed international instruments by the UN. That's what I was mentioning. And therefore, the international laws apply on those, on particularly on the treaty process that's involved with a lot of First Nations. So there's a lot of jurisdictions involved when we're talking about consultation, and with regards to water, to land, to whatever we're dealing with. There's very many jurisdictions that are overlapping, and there's a lot of confusion that takes place. And I can imagine through industry, like the confusion that exists there, and the confusion even that exists with Alberta government. Like for example, like Tsutina Press, Tsutina is against the Springbank water, situation, the dam, the dry dam. So this is real, this is what happened. We had Alberta government come in and do consultation, what they deem as consultation with our bureaucrats at Tsutina. And then that old government is gone, there's a new government now. And the new government said, the new government at Tsutina said, you can't, we don't acknowledge that. We don't acknowledge the consultation that Alberta, that you say that you did here. And the bureaucrats come with a big stack of papers, and they said, oh no, we did, we could look at all these papers we got. And our leadership said, no, just because your bureaucrats talk to our bureaucrats, that's not consultation. And you failed we didn't consent. Will you give consent on that? So this is the new government of Tsuut'ina. And I think that's kind of like the legs that our chief is standing on, Chief Kochal, our new chief. And I think that's, that's going to be a good test if we pursue it into litigation with regards to consultation, because it's the threat is the groundwater at Tsuut'ina. That's the threat of a part of it. And there's other proposals out there that are trying to make it forward to Alberta government's table and Calgary's table, but they're going to have nothing to do with those other proposals. So it's a real difficult place to be at, and that's just one example. I don't even know about the big things like with oil and gas and all that other stuff. This is just like one thing, which I think is relative. I'm not saying it's minor, but it's kind of a little bit. It hasn't happened yet, So just to share that, and my point was on the treaties, and that was studied to death by rapporteurs special rapporteur from the UN, who deemed that the treaties are legally binding under international instruments. So I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
In terms of international binding international agreements, right? Canada is not bound by under it, right? Because it's a declaration, right? But we are bound by the Organization of American States, Inter-American Human Rights, and the Inter-American Human Rights Tribunal. And we're bound because we're a member of the OAS. So, and First Nations in Canada have had recourse to the International Human Rights Tribunal, Inter-American Human Rights Tribunal, in the past, including the Lubicon and the Inuit in terms of black carbon. The difficulty, of course, is that international courts refuse jurisdiction, right, unless you've exhausted the Canadian remedies, right? And so you can appeal to the international court, right, if you're aggrieved, but they have to be satisfied that you exhausted all of your remedies, right? And so you can't go direct to those international tribunals. Yeah.
Sorry, just to qualify that happened under Bill C-31, remember?
Yes.
It was all exhausted in Canada, so the people that were, against it, they went to the UN. And I just want to confirm it, that's one example that happened, like you used to say. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much. We should move on to questions for Michelle. Is there someone that can come forward for that?
Hi, Michelle, and thank you again for some very thought-provoking questions. And Nancy, it's quite interesting because your question was the question that our table began with. And we were very lucky to have Professor Daniel Roth sitting at our table. So we had a Coles Notes version of his 13-week course on Indigenous law. And that started our discussions. But Michelle, he said something quite eloquent that I want to say, and it built on your talk when we were talking about law. And he said that you have to think about law as something that extends beyond kinship networks to interactions with the river and things that we consider to be non-sentient. And so he questioned it to us in terms of changing our thinking about the law was how would we interact with the river as our grandparents? And then he asked us, how much poison can we give our grandparents? And so I wanted to put that out there because it made us think at our table. But from the other 4 tables that we're thinking about the questions you asked, I'll ask 2 interrelated questions here first, which is what relevant parts of Indigenous law can guide, and Western law can guide the conversations about water and the use of water. And then we were also talking about how we have to think about multiple answers rather than a one solution for all answer, and also to think holistically, again, with those relationships that you were talking about, and how do we build trust as part of that. And then also in response to your question about how might Indigenous law help us to negotiate between economic development and the creation of jobs and the well-being of Indigenous waters, we'd also, again, I want to acknowledge Daniel's expertise and contributions to our conversation. ask you to maybe comment on that question by thinking about bringing the fact that Indigenous peoples before contact had massive economies that moved a lot of goods and that built very complex economic relationships over vast territories, but that were not profit-oriented.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much for those questions. I will try my best to, I'll reflect on them. I'm not going to say that I'm going to, I don't think that there's one right answer to that. And I'm looking forward to hearing everyone else's kind of reflections on these questions afterwards as well. For the first question, I think I want to go back to the question that you posed in terms of, well, what is Indigenous law? And I'm sorry, Diane. So Diane, you spoke about treaties as reflecting Indigenous law. And what I was thinking was that the practice of treaty making was something that, from my understanding, that Indigenous nations did prior to colonial settlement and and that there was a lot of diplomatic relations that were formed between our nations. And so when I think of Indigenous law, I think of the hundreds of different Indigenous nations on what we now know as Canada, and that they each embody their own political and legal orders. And so moving to Vancouver, taking up this new position at UBC, I've had to think about what it means for me to be a Cree woman that's not living on my home territory, and that's living on Coast Salish territory, on Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And the process of me just learning about the history and about the culture of the people that live there. And now when I say culture, I really mean those political and legal orders, right? Like, that's what I mean by culture, that our communities had very organized and systematic ways of sharing territory, of relating with one another, that we had treaties that guided these trading networks, these expansive economic trading networks that we had. And so as I think about how Indigenous law then can guide our relationships with water and our use of water, management and governance of water, as a geographer, I'm always thinking about, well, how does Indigenous law force us to kind of think beyond the territorial jurisdictions that have been imposed on us, whether that's, that's something that I reflected on a bit in my talk, whether that's the reserve or the treaty territory or provincial or even geopolitical boundaries, right? There's many nations who their home territories have been separated by the geopolitical Canadian and U.S. border, and now particularly on the West Coast, Emma Norman, for example, she's a geographer that came out of UBC Geography. She's written about well, what does it mean to think about rescaling Indigenous water governance beyond jurisdictions that we continue to be restricted by. And so I think part of that is continuing to work within the systems that we are subjected to, right, and trying to make those small changes as we go. And then another piece is this piece that I like to think of as Indigenous resurgence, so rebuilding those relationships across Indigenous communities. And I think oftentimes the conversation of how do we rebuild these relationships of trust, I often think, well, who is the we? Because I think part of that is certainly we could be building trust between settler Canadians and Indigenous communities, but also there needs to be a lot of rebuilding of trust within Indigenous communities and amongst communities as well, because that colonial violence has also been felt and has also impacted our political and legal relationships, our diplomatic relationships. And so when I think of how do we rebuild that trust, I also think of all of that work that needs to be done at the community level, and I really try to prioritize that when I teach my students, when I do my research, and when I write about this and speak about this, that I highlight that as well. Let's see, what else did I want to say here? Okay, so the comment on economic development. So The reason why I asked that question is because I think it's a very difficult and contentious question that comes up in many Indigenous communities right now. And it's very easy for me to critique all of the mining developments that are taking place in my home territory when I do have a relatively privileged position that I work in an academic institution, and that I don't depend on the jobs that a lot of people in my family and a lot of people in my community are, that they're holding out for, as a lot of these mining developments are being proposed. But I think it's also important to again kind of complicate that, because just from speaking with people in my community, I know that they feel like that's the only thing that they can do, right? The jobs that have been available in my community have been either in the band council or in the fur trade, and then in the lumber industry, and now within the mining industry. And a lot of them feel like that choice is very much constrained, that we actually don't really have true, we don't really have what's the word that I'm looking for? True freedom really in making the choices that we want, and that we're and that is partly tied to impact benefit agreements, because there's clauses within those impact benefit agreements, and David probably knows more about this than I do, but that confidentiality clauses. So you spoke about the secrecy at the provincial level. There's also a lot of secrecy that happens at the community level, where only the band council is in negotiation for these developments that are being proposed for our communities. And then that again generates more distrust within the community. And then I also ask myself, well, who is being represented on these band council systems? And that's not to disrespect our leaders. I have an uncle that was a chief for a decade, and I know that these people do good work, but the band council system has historically been a system, it's a colonial system that's been imposed on our communities that has historically excluded the authority and leadership of women, of elders, of youth, of two-spirited and queer people in our communities. And those legacies continue on today, even though there are women that are coming into that system. And so I kind of ask myself, like, who are the authorities that are making the decisions within our communities? Sorry, I don't know where I'm going with this, but
You're reflecting.
Yeah. So I guess kind of going back to economic development, yes, these are just kind of the very hard questions that we're coming up against in terms of what are we going to do. And I think that part of it is our long-standing economic traditions are not rooted in a capitalist system. And Adrian talked a lot about that today, I think, right? And how she, again, brought up this idea of the commons. But I think, again, what I want to stress and what I want to add to that is that as we're coming together and building these solidarities, that it's not just a resistance against the capitalist system, but it's always how capitalism works with settler colonialism and continues to do so today within Canada. And if we're not addressing that colonial component, that colonialism didn't just happen in the 1500s, like many of my students seem to think when they come into my intro class, but that it continues to reproduce itself, and that we need to also resist against that, and that needs to also be part of the conversation.
And can I just add too, I mean, when we think about settler colonialism, one of the things it does is it's dependent on erasure of Indigenous presence. And so what are the ways in which that happens? And it's in the breakdown of Indigenous governance. It's in the erasure of Indigenous languages and the lack of support for that through education systems. I mean, I could stand up here and talk all day about the ways in which federal, provincial, municipal governments, education institutions are still moving to erase Indigenous presence. And so that is such a good point to make, that's such a key component of that underpins a lot of the stuff that happens around Indigenous consent and also presence within decision making circles. And I just want to briefly, before we turn it over, I just want to briefly talk a little bit about the Buffalo Treaty, which is an international buffalo treaty, which is authored by Dr. Leroy Little Bear in consultation with elders from the Kainai Blackfoot Nation. And basically, it's an international treaty that was concluded between 8 nations, 4 in Alberta and 4 in Montana, as a commitment to support the buffalo, to bring the buffalo back. Not and people tend to think of buffalo in the same way they think of water, that it's a commodity, that it's based for sustenance only. And so it's about returning back to those original relationships, as the buffalo is our teacher, as we have a responsibility to the buffalo, that the health of the land is dependent on the buffalo. And so it's interesting to me to listen today, and there's a lot of commonalities with how water is viewed as well, as a relative, as something we have responsibility for, as something that we need to protect for future generations. And so the treaty is working within Indigenous nations, and it's around what Michelle's talking about in terms of that resurgence, that it wasn't, let's ask Canada and let's ask the US what they think. It was just done without them. And they're kind of scrambling now, like, oh, what does this mean? So now it's up to 20. 20 Indigenous nations have signed on to the treaty. It's moving into my territory this summer, into Treaty 6. And now it's also inspiring some of the nations in more coastal areas to think about a salmon treaty. What does that look like when we are here to work together to protect these entities with whom we have depended on for very, very long time, and who we still continue to have responsibilities to, and moving out of this notion of commodification, which has been imposed on us. So there's lots of commonalities here. I think at this point, we open it up to questions and thoughts that people would like to share in general. I need my agenda. I left it behind. There we go. Just making sure I'm on the right track here. Yeah. So I guess the question is, what have we learned? And that's a big question. Who would like to start from the audience?
I will. It's more of a thought rather than I guess a question. But I think when we begin to work with Indigenous law, I guess in our Treaty 7 community especially, and we just produced the Indigenous Policy Framework for the City of Calgary. And one of the grounding and foundational pieces is we had an Indigenous declaration within our Blackfoot Confederacy, and it's an ancient declaration, and it's our Constitution. And our Constitution is based on our relationship to the land, our relationship to Creator, and our I guess the provisions from Creator. And so this law is really quite ancient, but we still practice. And when we talk about duty to consult or any of that activity, any engagement activity, it's based on that ancient declaration and our Constitution. And when we begin to work with our traditional knowledge keepers in the area, their whole philosophy and thought process is based on that declaration and Constitution. And so anything that we do is an accountability and a stewardship practice to our Creator. And we, I guess, live it through our songs, our ceremonies, our language, our practices. They're all very, that's what provides and sustains us as people. And so there has to begin to be a relationship between our way of life, our belief systems, and this special constitution of our natural laws. Mainstream doesn't understand that. And I think that is the piece and the gap that's missing for the commonality right now. If we're ever going to get to the commonality of how we're going to discuss water or any activity in our natural environment, I think that is a practice that has to be learned by mainstream. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and it goes back to thinking how would we, if we think of water as our grandmother, how does that change how we interact and engage with it as an entity?
Well, the New Zealand has under the Treaty of Waratanga, right, they appoint a lawyer, right, for the river. So
yeah, it has,
that's one way to do that.
Yeah, the Whangarei River in New Zealand is now an entity with the same rights as anyone living in New Zealand. And
this, by the way, is not that uncommon in common law.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a Buddhist statute that was given the right of a person back in 1910 by the Privy Council. So it's not a foreign concept in common law. So.
Well, one of our very important sacred practices comes from the water, and so in honoring that sacred practice, and it's a gift from our water beings, is how we treat the water. And so I think if you begin to understand it and frame it in a sense where we are living these practices, they're not like historic, they're not over there, we didn't practice them 100 years ago, we're currently practicing them. I think it really shifts the, I guess, the importance of understanding our Indigenous law and our Indigenous practices.
What was the second person who had their hand up? Was that you?
It was just a remark, and it may continue on what Lorna said, but basically what we have to do is the opposite of erasure. It's the anti-erasure of the indigenous way of thinking that has to be inserted. So if you maybe look at what are the forces that are working towards like erasing it, then you may be understanding avenues that you can use in which to actually insert it. So it becomes a commonality. People who are non-Indigenous start assimilating that way of thinking, so it becomes natural to think of the river as an entity that is equally important to you in every aspect of life, and these kinds of things. So.
Yeah, I'll just quickly mention something Adrian talked about was the privileging of the human, right, in the human perspective, and that what happens when we start to dismantle that hierarchy, for sure. Who's anyone? Did the panelists want to add anything?
One contribution I would suggest is watch your language, right? I'm serious in the sense that we talk about land claims, right? And the federal government does it, the provincial government, that says, oh, these are Aboriginal land claims, right? They're not. They're promise-keeping, right? If Western settlers want to have the right to dominate the land, they've got to come to a settlement agreement. That's the principles behind the honor of the crown, the royal proclamation, right? And so it's not Aboriginal land claims, right? It's promise keeping. So that's one. The other one is when you talk about, and the courts do this, you talk about Aboriginal rights. And so what happens is, Aboriginal rights are traditional activities at the time of contact, right? And so even though those rights have been, those activities have been carried out and are governed by Indigenous laws that are still extant, right? You have to go to the court to prove your claimed Aboriginal right. And then by transmorphication, it becomes owned by that particular First Nation group. Right. So, and that's why I started with flipping the dialogue on the head, right? Talking about what was here before and what has been lost, but what's been what's recoverable, right? And what the impact was on Canadian. And so start thinking in that way. What was here before? What was the prehistory? I mean, it's history. Right? What were the cultures like? Find out what the people, talk with your Indigenous neighbors, talk with your other people to find out, what existed before. Become interested in history, right? So those are some concrete suggestions, right? To go further into, what was here before and what's still here.
Yes. Middle there.
I've been thinking about something that Adrian Parker was talking about when she was talking about horizontal and vertical forms of action and the need to both kind of weave together social movements or stand in solidarity while at the same time thinking critically about interventions maybe within the legal sphere or otherwise. I'm just wondering if anybody really would want to comment on, in the Alberta context, what's next in terms of horizontal action or vertical action, and if we were to, jump into a time machine 10 years from now, what might have changed between today and 10 years from now? Because I'm thinking, in the context of climate change and these converging pressures, we don't necessarily have a ton of time. So what are we going to do?
Yeah. Does anyone want to respond that's in the room? Have some thoughts about that?
I guess, is it about, in a sense, what are the emerging water issues right now? Where are the pressures at the moment?
What are the emerging opportunities for collective action?
Surely there's somebody involved in something in this room.
I would throw it back to you, though, right? It's the communities, it's the public, right, that has to come up with ideas. And that includes Indigenous peoples, right? And so governments aren't going to do anything unless they're pressured to do it, right? So organize, think about, talk to your neighbors, right? And that's the only way you can really create, right? And there's a lot of advocacy groups and organizations that are there to help you and guide you, right? But it becomes incumbent on you as a citizen to advocate, to learn, right? So I'd throw it back at you in the sense of, well, where do you want to be 10 years from now?
And I kind of like your question because I am a half cup full kind of gal. And, I guess maybe it's my vision, but maybe it's also, I think, a movement that is happening is an increasing recognition that water is an issue. I think maybe we didn't think that way 50 years ago. And so I think that's a success. I also think around the world and even here, we're seeing cities who are actually starting to get worried about their water sources. So you look at Vancouver, you look at New York City, they have actually started to protect their headwaters. Edmonton, 80% of Edmontonians want to protect their headwaters. They kind of saw what happened here in Calgary, and they don't really want to have those kind of floods. And I think that there's something that we can collectively as a community ride forward on. I think another thing from an Indigenous perspective is the increasing voices globally and certainly here in Canada, and the increasing capacity and empowerment of Indigenous people to be voices and to realize the leadership positions that they do have on water and on actually terrestrial conservation, which is about the whole picture together. And I think there's a lot of power in that, and I think there's a lot of future in that.
And again, just to go back to the Buffalo Treaty model, what's happening because of relationships that are being built between the treaty signatories and the nations with conservation groups, with researchers, is it's about like a relationship building. And at the core of that is trust, because we've been burned a lot over the years. And so it's around that notion of people coming to the table, people willing to make space, people, and I'm talking in terms of non-Indigenous groups, recognizing, the history of paternalism within non-Indigenous organizations and educational institutions, et cetera, et cetera. And it's about making space for those Indigenous voices in leadership to come forward, to contribute, to be valued, to be listened to. I come from the film world, and we're really struggling right now with, they'll bring one of us in, we'll be consulted, our name will be put on the project to legitimize it, but we don't get listened to, and people do what they're going to do anyway, right? And so I would just note, again, it's about that relationship building and trust in multiple places, right? And to reach out to community, to reach out to people doing the work from within Indigenous communities, and recognizing that we're all in a process of recovery as well, right? Recognizing that Indigenous people, we're going to make a misstep, we're going to do some, and so many times that happens, and then people walk away, oh, they don't know what they're doing, right? We do. We're recovering. We are, going back and I think about the treaty again as an example. Leroy Little Bear, yes, he wrote the treaty, but after years of working with knowledge keepers, right? What did the knowledge keepers of the community say? The women in the community say, right? And then put that together. So it's happening. And so I think that's part of it too. I'll move.
Hi, just in response to what's next and what should be a priority, one of the discussions that we kept having at our table was that we came to understand our privilege, most of us at this table, right? Our privilege and the privilege of turning on a tap of water and drinking clean water out of our tap. And then we realized as we were having that conversation that that's not the case for Indigenous communities, right? So in terms of what's next, one of the promises in the speech from the throne was that there will be, and that the government, the Alberta government has made a commitment to making sure that there will be clean waters, and we need to hold the government to that promise at both levels, right?
We have lots of time.
Sorry. Doing in some of the work that I'm doing at where I work at Sutuna, I was doing a lot of reading and research on Alberta government and their deliverables that they do in the areas of water, all of the work that's going on with climate change, with water, with this thing, with that other thing, with consultation. And one of the things I was consistent throughout all the documents that I was reading was that there's really no contact or no First Nation person is on those boards. And I just to reiterate what our moderator is telling us is that I think when Perry Bellegarde, or when the Paris Agreement, or when Trudeau came back in Vancouver, and Perry Bellegarde was there, and somebody, one of the chiefs, stomped out of there, was from Northern Alberta. He was not satisfied with what the talks were about and what was signed off on, and that Trudeau was not going to meet with him or give him 5 minutes. And then later, when Mr. Chief Perry Bellegarde was being interviewed, and he was posed the question, well, what do you want? There's no more rooms on the energy board. They're all filled up. There's no more room on any of those boards. And Perry Bellegarde's simple response, which was a really good response, was, well, make room. And I think that just kind of sums it up, because I know that a lot of activities that take place in government it's exclusive. It's not inclusive. I guess that's my point. Thank you.
Yes, I have a question to both Michelle and David, because Adrian Power mentioned Negri and Hart and Commonwealth. I would like to ask you both, what about internationalization and internationalism within issues where you have local and global issues that are very conflictual and also need a lot of healing through, looking at the past, looking at the future. So these issues may be here and now, but they are global issues where, you talk about nations, but the capitalist states are all over, and there are many other nations all over the world that have, Pasolini would say, a peasant problem with water, with resources. So how these native community face internationalism in a Marxist way, if I may.
No, I want to respond on sort of two levels. One is on a personal level, you only have so much energy. You only have so much energy, right? Well, yeah. That's not likely to. Well, yeah, it probably is in Canada, but it's a matter of personal priority, right? So, if you are engaged in and believe that the local issues are more important because they affect your family, your relatives, even the animals and stuff that are your brothers and sisters. And any excess from that you can devote to international issues. If you see it as being, and I think that's one of the differences from the Indigenous world, viewpoint, and that is the sense that, from my experience, Indigenous people don't talk about things they don't see, they don't know. They're very cautious when, for example, they go to another territory and they want to discover and they're very careful in doing that. On the Western side, you have these elaborate theories, neoliberalism, Marxism, to control and define the relationships and the orders between people. And as I get older, they're fine and dandy, but what works in theory doesn't work in practice, right? That's the people are messy. They don't fit into neat categories. You don't have the right. You don't have the left. You don't have a capitalist. You don't have a racist. You don't have, people are complicated. So I would look at, trying to challenge the capitalist, the neo-global system, or is on a broad-based basis, is, for me at least, would be wasting my effort. Right. And that's a personal choice. So I don't know if that.
Okay, thank you for that question. I think it's a really important question. I appreciate you bringing that forth. I think for me, the way that I want to start to answer that question is just to a decolonial framing of what the international is. Jeff Corntassel, who I've had the privilege to study under at the Indigenous Governance Program, he writes about how if we're going to, and he writes on Indigenous international relations. He's written a lot on the UN's Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights. And he starts by framing the international by thinking about, again, this notion of indigenous nations that I spoke about, right? And that in and of itself is another way of thinking about international. It's a decolonial way of thinking about it. It ruptures kind of our understandings of international as being simply these geopolitical relationships of nation states, of settler states. And so that's how I tried to start to think about it, right? And how I'm trying to rebuild these international relations, Cree relations with Anishinaabe, with Musqueam. Maybe this is the first time someone from my neck end of the woods has actually, or from my family or community has actually lived on Musqueam territory. And so I'm building that relationship anew right now. And then kind of thinking about how that builds out. And I do think, so you mentioned the importance of solidarities and, and how, and is it important to build those solidarities between different Indigenous communities, or maybe some communities in the Latin American context, that some who identify as Indigenous, some who have identified themselves as peasant. There's also another political identity that's been mobilized on the African continent. Can't remember which, if anyone knows sorry, I can't remember that, but but where these groups do have Indigenous roots, right? And I think that we've witnessed that in part at Standing Rock, where we saw different people from different Indigenous groups and peasant groups that came to Standing Rock, and that people are uniting, I think, based on these common understandings and relationships to land and to water, but also a common experience, as you say, in terms of capitalist dispossession, but I think also colonial dispossession as well. So not just thinking about capitalism as a global system, but also thinking about how colonialism remains kind of a global process today as well, and maybe that happens in different ways in different places, but that there's still that commonality there, and that's something that I've been trying to think more deeply about in my class, because this past term, I had quite a few students from Latin America, and I was teaching about settler colonialism in Canada. And so now I'm doing a lot of catch up to learn more about the history and ongoing reproduction of colonialism within the Latin American context, and trying to build on that conversation in this class. And then also recognizing how a lot of Canadian mining companies are actually drilling and dispossessing Indigenous people of their land and waters in places like Peru and Bolivia. And to kind of build that into the conversation as well, and to look at the commonalities. So I would say that I do see kind of more of these grassroots forms of relationship building that are happening at Standing Rock. And there's also Dawn Morrison, who is she's the founder and chair of the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Network, out of the BC, and that was born out of the BC Food Systems Network. So not particularly related to water, but Dawn is doing a lot of work around the Site C Dam, and she has gone to different places in Latin America, on the African continent, to kind of like these exchanges where people will go from her community, and they'll have these conversations and dialogues with other folks about what's going on in their community. So I think, as David is saying, there's a lot, we have limited energy, and I think a lot of us want to put that time and energy into the communities where we're from and where we're currently living and working. But you're right that these types of encounters and relationship building are also very important, and to recognize that we have a lot of displaced people. So it's not just, we have to complicate the category of settler in Canada, and that we have a lot of people that have also been dispossessed of their territories, and that's why they're here. And to kind of, and I will say, for me as a Cree person, that I need to think about that when people are coming into my territory, if that's why they're coming there. So that needs to be part of the conversation. So thank you for that question.
Yeah. I think we have a comment from Mac here, a question.
Yeah, we've been picking on governments a lot. And so I want to kind of change that a little bit with my question. And I've been thinking, sitting here and, talking about, going back to more ancient, philosophies and perspectives. And then I look out the window and I see this thriving metropolis outside here, and this ain't going to change. So I think everybody, and since we're with the University of Calgary Humanities Council here, a philosophical issue is that people are going to probably operate in their best interest. So what this is leading to is my question, which is, I'm wondering, as I'm sitting here, how is it possible to have the Indigenous perspective be married with the best of scientific and academic thought and ideas? Because it seems to me that, the extent to which there's, overlap between the indigenous perspective and good science and good things that will lead to, as we said at our table, clean water in, clean water out, or whatever the principle is. How is it possible that there can be more intersection between the academic world, the science world, and the indigenous perspective?
What we're saying about boards and groups is the same for the university, and people need to move over to understand and recognize indigenous notions of science, that's good science. And I challenge you a little bit that if we pollute our waters, just how long will that downtown be standing? In 50 years, in 100 years. But I agree, there needs to be continued conversation within. And, when you talk about decolonizing, we need to decolonize the universities. And I'm glad the dean talked about that, indigenous knowledge and science are not two separate entities. They actually complement each other very well. It's just one side's not listening that well. So, yeah, I think there are ways to integrate that in. We talk about ancient, and it's true, but they're also very present and in the now and in the future. And so, I still think there's ways that those philosophies, those ways of knowledge and thought and worldview can be listened to and incorporated, because they haven't been at all. So I think what we're advocating is that beginning to listen and making space. But I'll pass it if you guys have thoughts on that too.
I would say at the Mount Royal Conference on Water in the fall, it was quite interesting and astonishing the parallels between the philosophers of posthumanism, which is a sort of a loose grouping of theories coming out of animal studies, environmental studies, various post-human philosophies, how closely and surprisingly they were paralleling the First Nations perspectives on exactly the same thing. And it was interesting to see the eyebrows of the European philosophers raise when they were realizing that we were talking about essentially the same, not exactly the same thing, but very interesting parallel tracks, I think. And I do believe that the universities in Canada, some of them are sincerely trying to engage in the process of decolonization.
Yeah, I brought together a 30-year park warden with science degrees with an Indigenous elder for 2 days, and the three of us sat in that room and talked about the buffalo and the interrelationship that it has, and talking about it from a science point of view as a keystone species and the way that it affects the land, and then the stories of the buffalo. And after the end of the 2 days, the elder, who's the late Narcissus Blood, told the scientist, "We're saying the same thing. We just have a different language to say it," right? And so, but it's about being able to come into the room with each other to get to that point, right?
Yeah, and I guess, my immediate reaction was, it was one of offense, and not to you in particular, but that the Western compulsion to categorize leads to control. It leads to silo effects. It's not pan-specific, and the implication in your mention of the current built environment is that this is better, and that how dare you want to integrate, traditional, old-fashioned philosophies into that worldview. And again, there's a congruence in post-human, most of the philosophies. And don't forget, of course, Chinese are the biggest population in the world. So they're a quarter of the world's population. India, Muslim, Christian/Western/European are a minority, right? So what gives them the ability to say, well, this is what we do best? I mean, it's like, and yes, Europeans have been successful And that's in part because of their organization and stuff like that. But all empires fall, all, things come to an end. So, one wants to be humble in looking at, what we're trying to do. And obviously what we're trying to do is make everything better for everybody. Right? So those are that's my response. And I apologize if it's sort of offend any offense.
Okay, well, speaking of things coming to an end, I think that we might. At this point call an end to the formal part of the day's proceedings. But if people would like to stick around and have one-on-one conversations, either with our panelists or with some of the other community members, citizens, people from community organizations, do feel free to stay and linger, grab a pamphlet, buy a book, who knows. At this point, however, I would like you to join me in thanking our wonderful moderator, Tasha Hubbard, and our two panelists for an engaging day.